I met him, and he wouldn't leave my father's store. For 3 weeks, he camped outside. He would throw rocks through my window with notes that said, "Please go out with me." Grandma, you little victim. What?
You know, when you ask your grandma or you ask Uda once how they met, they always try to make up a love story. But then when you really listen to the love story, you will see that it was abusive or it was not just right. So this lady posted that her grandma gave her a love story and she was like, eh? Grandma, you're the victim. And this got a lot of people coming to talk about their grandma love story. Let me roll some clip for you all to watch at the end, and I'll be back to share my thoughts at the end of the video.
And he wouldn't leave my father's store. For 3 weeks, he camped outside.
So when I was 20 years old, my family took a vacation to Mexico City to go visit all of our extended family. And my great aunt Eva took us around the town. We were on, I think it was a trolley. Yeah, it was a trolley system to get out to go see La Basilica in like downtown area, like the big cathedral that has the Virgen thing. And she's pointing out all these really cool landmarks, giving us a lot of history lessons. And then she's showing us really beautiful things like, oh, look, this is where your great-grandfather had this business. This is where we used to play when we were growing up. This is where your grandmother went to school. This is where our lemonade stand was growing up, because that's what my grandfather did as a side business. And that's the window of our house that your grandfather kidnapped your grandmother through. What? My grandfather was considerably older than my grandmother when they met, and she was 15. My great-grandfather said, hell no, you guys can't date. That's terrible. Which is why I never accept the excuse when people say, like, it was a different time. No, it doesn't matter what the time was. People knew that was terrible. And in response to that rejection, my grandfather and his best friend conspired and broke into their house, kidnapped my grandmother, and left my great-grandfather a note saying, if you think you can keep us apart, just know that I can have her whenever I want. And then my great-grandfather relented and said, sure, get married. She was 16. I think my grandfather, he was 26 at the time. And no one's ever told us this story. If you listen to the people in my family talk about their marriage, you would think it was the greatest love story ever told. Or really horrific. Thankfully, my grandfather changed his ways. Unfortunately, my grandmother had a very difficult life. They had a very hard marriage. She had 9 children, but like 13 pregnancies. And she died at 45 of a stroke. He completely reformed. Everything changed. He became what I imagine to be just a much better man, because I don't even recognize who the man is in some of these stories that I hear about him. He was the most precious man of my life while he was still with us. And I'm forever grateful that he got himself together. But like, oh my God. I mean, what's more romantic than a little kidnapping?
You little victim. What the fuck?
Okay, so my grandma was about 16 when she met my grandfather, who was in his early 30s. She agreed to marry him because she was at risk of experiencing sexual violence in her own home. She then proceeded to be pregnant for about 9 years straight, got a little break, and then popped out 2 more, 11 children total. My grandfather wanted 20, so she had to get her tubes tied in secret. My grandfather later had a brawl with the doctor who did the procedure. All my life, my mom didn't reveal a lot about her parents, but about 2 years ago, she was finally able to admit that my grandfather was an adulterer. He had many children out of wedlock, including one that's my age, who was born like shortly before he died. And also the other day she said, well, I guess my dad did beat my mom.
And I met him, and he wouldn't leave my father's store. For 3 weeks.
My whole family tells the story about how my grandma and grandpa met and how it was the cutest thing ever. And it wasn't until I was an adult when I realized how creepy it was. Essentially, my grandma was 12 or 13 and my grandpa was 18 or 19. And one day my grandma was playing jump rope with her siblings and her friends outside her house. My grandpa used to stand kind of nearby and watch her play because he thought she was so cute. One day he got the guts to walk up to the front door of the house, not my grandma, but to the house, knock on the door and asked if her parents were home. and her parents had passed away already, so she was being raised by her older brothers. Her brother answered the door, and my grandpa was like, "Hey, I like that girl out there. I would like to marry her, please." And her brothers, who were having a hard time paying for the mouths to feed and everything, were like, "Yeah, one less mouth to feed, absolutely, you can have her." And even though my grandparents were together for 50, 60 years, I don't remember, they were together their entire lives. They passed away in their 90s. They were relatively happy together. My grandma used to always say, when your grandpa walked up to me and said, "I've asked your brothers and they're okay with me marrying you and I can have you now as my wife," she always used to say, "I cried so much. And then eventually, I really fell for your grandpa and I loved him." Like, that's not okay. Who thought this was a cute story?
Grandma, you little victim. What the fuck?
My great-grandmother was one of the most kick-ass people I've ever met or heard stories about. I swear to you, I get my F-off energy from this woman. So when she was a teenager, that's when her family is like, "You need to start courting, we gotta find you a husband," because all she had was an 8th grade education, and they really wanted her to marry somebody wealthy or with status. So she was courting this man, and this man essayed her. And my grandma, great grandma, she fought back. Like, that's the story, is that this man was groping, doing his thing, chicken wing, and she shoved him out of the carriage. He fell into the mud. The family was so embarrassed. They're like, "You need to go apologize to him, and hopefully you could win his favor back." And my grandma's like, "No, absolutely not." So then she meets my grandpa and falls madly in love. So my grandpa was born in 1900. She was born in 1905. So they end up getting married in 1924. He's 25 years old. She's 19 years old. He served in World War I, and all he was a lowly farmer. Not only that, the family that he came from, he ended up inheriting the land. But I'm pretty sure, I'm trying to remember the exact story, his mother died in childbirth, and so he was like adopted by these as like a farmhand. So her family was just like, "Clara, you cannot marry this man." And she's like, "I'll do what I want." So she was married to him, and he ended up dying in 1949, which was really sad. He was 49 years old, and they had 7 kids. So this is where I'm like, I love this woman so much. So first off, she married who she wanted and just told her family they can go get bent. Then, after he passed away, a woman back in the late 40s, early 50s, with 7 children, who had a bunch of farmland and only an 8th grade education, obviously she's going to remarry, right? Absolutely not. Her quote is, "Any man that wants to marry a middle-aged woman with 7 kids wants to use her son as workhorses, her daughters for their own pleasures, and steal her land. And I'm not interested." This woman lived to be 100 years old. Like, one of my favorite things is I have a 5-generation picture with me holding my oldest daughter and her and my grandma and my mom. And it's just amazing to see. But I just think about that like, all of these stitches are so just depressing and awful. And I love so much that I have this strong-ass woman in my family, because my grandma, her daughter, her story's not great. My grandpa was predatory, just like all the other stories we're hearing. But my great-grandma, man, like, that's, like, after my divorce, when I became single, I kept thinking about how hard that had to be for her as a single mother in the 50s with 7 kids, with all of this land, trying to make it work, trying to raise these kids on her own, and adamantly refusing to marry. Because her thought was, "I already married the love of my life. I'm good." She had 25 years with this man. 25, that's all she had with this man. And I said served the rest of her life. It feels like a sentence, yeah. Living. She spent the rest of her life with just her children, her friends, and she was content. One of the other quotes that she used to say that always cracked me up is, she said, "Never trust a man. They would screw a snake if they could get so low." Now, she's obviously not with us anymore. She died in 2005. But I really wish I could have thought to ask her more about why she took such a strong stand, because that is just not common for that age of woman to be so, like, verbally, like, "Don't ever trust men. Men are trash." I mean, that's what it is. It's that her generation's equivalent of "men are trash." So yeah, there's a positive story with this trend that's going on, because most of the stories are negative. Also, my great-grandpa was known as being an absolute gem as a human. He was just the kindest, big-hearted person. That's probably what my grandmother fell in love with. That's all.
And I met him, and he wouldn't leave my father's store for 3 weeks.
So when my grandma told me the story of how her and my grandpa met, I was like, oh, so everyone's just gonna, I'm probably gonna get yelled at for this video. Anyway, grandma was walking down the street with a friend. She was probably 14, 15 years old. She got married at 16. So my grandpa pulls up and he said, what's your name? And he won't leave her alone. And she lied and she said, my name's Ellen. She and her friend leave. They keep walking and he kept bothering and wouldn't leave him alone, but she just let it go. Okay. He goes all around town asking everyone, who's Ellen? Who's Ellen? She has blonde hair, blue eyes, small, really cute. And he meets her Uncle Ben. Grandma's mom was a widow, okay? They had no money. She was working as a seamstress. Grandma had to drop out of school because she couldn't afford to pay for books. Okay. So they end up getting married. And at the wedding, this is the what still bothers me. Grandma's family wasn't invited. It was just his family. And it was in a town that was pretty far away from where her family lived. I mean, not so much today, probably an hour and a half. I don't know why they chose that town. She wore a blue wedding dress. Yeah. And this is the same grandpa who got the neighbor pregnant. Fun times by all.
Grandma, you little victim.
So my papa on my dad's side was a milk boy, and he would deliver milk to my grandma's house. And they said the first time that he saw her, he just fell in love with her. Grandma did not feel the same. Apparently, according to family lore, she repeatedly told him to go away. She was like not interested. I think she was in love with somebody else at the time. But my papa, bless his heart, did not give up that easily. So he pushed forward and kept annoying her until she eventually conceded and went on a date with him. And they got married not long after that. Now, I'm not saying that there was no love there because I think they loved each other very much, but I am saying that grandma used to save money all year round. She would like squirrel it away in little holes in the house so that at the end of the year, she and all her friends could go get like lit in Vegas. So my cousins and I are not convinced that she would have gotten married and had kids that young if she would have had like more options. Now, my papa on the other side, I would consider him a victim. This is my mom's father. My grandma was madly in love with him, that he didn't even notice her, where she was not a blip on his radar. So she used to put on like the skimpiest bikinis that she could get away with for the time and crawl up on top of one of the chicken houses that he would have to like walk by on his way to work and just pose. She claimed that it was because she wanted to suntan up there, but it was specifically to make Papa look at her. And that doesn't sound like he was a victim. Like that just sounds like some girl flirting, but you haven't met her. Like if you talked to her for 37 seconds, you would, that poor man was a victim.
Aw, you little victim. What the fuck?
My grandma used to tell us the story about how she met my grandpa and she was just walking home from school one day and this man in his truck was behind her telling her how beautiful she was, and he would follow her home every single day. She was 15. He was not in school. Until she finally said yes to marry him. And my 13-year-old self was like, oh, he knew, and he loved her. But my adult self is like, holy shit, Grandpa, you're a predator. And no wonder why my grandma was such a bitch all the time. I would be too.
And I met him, and he wouldn't leave my father's store for 3 weeks.
I have this family member that every time he would get up in church and tell the story about how him and his wife met, he would say that he was picking his daughter up from the school bus and he saw this little girl on the bus and he knew that that was his wife. Yeah, the age gap is crazy. But the bad part is nobody in church was like, yeah, grown men lusting after little girls on school buses is wrong. They were like, God really spoke to you. God really showed you. And it took me and my cousins years to realize that's disgusting.
Grandma, you little victim. What?
So one day my grandma comes to me and she's like, I think I'm gonna die soon. I want you to know my life story. And I'm like, okay, this is never a good way. This is never a good way to start a conversation. So she has a very, very lenient upbringing. Tries to join the Air Force and doesn't work. My grandma cannot iron. My grandma cannot fold. My grandma cannot walk in a straight line, apparently. So cool. She also meets an airman while she's there. Right? I don't know how that works, but just unreliable narrator, maybe? I don't fucking know. Anyway, this man is pursuing. This man is fucking. We have to get, like, I love you, want to marry you right now. Those of you who like know the military, they're like, that tracks. That's a ponytail. I want a bun. So they get married, and right away, Grandpa is like, gotta have a kid right now. BT dubs, my mother's dying. We need to have a kid right now. So my grandma goes, okay, cool. So she's just really trying to get this woman to like her, to have a kid with this guy. And then they have a kid, and they have a kid right before his mother dies. She gets to see my dad. Yay. Then she finds love letters under this man's bed. I don't know if it's their bed. I don't know. It's just, it was like 1950? No, it was 1964 or something. I don't fucking know. So she finds love letters. She finds love letters to a dude. And she's just like, I don't know what is going on. I don't know what's happening. You love me. Why are these love letters to somebody else? And he's like, actually, I just really wanted a kid so my mom could see I had a kid before she died. By the way, don't knock it till you try it. So my grandma tries it. My grandma becomes a lesbian. Right? And years and years later, tragedy, she finds the church, or the missionaries find her, and they're like, cool, there's this really cool place called heaven that you could go to. We could get you in, but you can't be a homosexual. So she and her lesbian lover decide to advertise out the extra room in their home. So they have a constant chaperone, so they're not gay, so they can go to heaven. And it's so sad. And then their chaperone dies. Because at this point, I'm like 12 or something. So everybody's kind of older. But yeah, the man that ruined my grandma's life, that made her a victim, I'm blaming God or the church or missionaries, because fuck all of them. Thanks for coming with me on this wild ride.
By the way, watching that back, I didn't get to blame my grandfather, but I blame him too. He used my grandmother as a walking uterus, so fuck him too.
Emma, you little victim. What the fuck?
So I would never have guessed this was going to be my first actual TikTok that I put out there. But my grandmother got pregnant with my mother when she was 15 years old. And the man who got her pregnant was an older married man who was the foreman for a oil field. When he found out, he made an arrangement with her parents, her father, that he would find a man that worked for him to marry her and then be the father of her children. So she was essentially sold to another man that worked for my, I guess, biological grandfather. She was 15. She married this 20-something adult man that worked in the oil fields. They did go on to have 8 more children, 9 in total. He was a raging alcoholic, beat her and the children. I found this out much later in life after they had both passed away, from my mother, who did end up leaving home at 16 because she was fed up with raising her mother's children, because my grandmother had to work to feed the children, because although my grandfather worked in the oil fields, he spent most of the money that he made on alcohol. So she ironed and sold eggs and cleaned houses, etc., while having 9 children. So learned all this from my mother. Found out her mother, my great-grandmother, also had a child at 15, had my grandmother at 15, but married another man who was willing to, I guess, take on that responsibility. So we definitely romanticize the good old days, but they definitely weren't good for everybody.
Grandma, you little victim. What the?
My grandmother was 14 to 15 years old when she got pregnant. My grandfather was around 20, 21, 23, 22. I'm not sure. It bounces back and forth. I have no idea. All I know is she gave birth around the age of 15. She had gone on a petty date with him. Not even like, oh, I want to go on a date with this guy. This guy's asked me out. No, I think it was a double date, and her friend wanted her to go on a date with her and this guy's friend, which turned out to be my grandfather. And she ended up pregnant. I'm not sure if they dated a little bit before the pregnancy happened or like right at the first date. But my grandmother's mom said, I am not raising a child. I'm not raising another child. Had enough. You're going to go marry that man. My grandmother did not want to marry him. Not one bit. She downright refused, but ended up marrying him anyway, because what was she going to do? She was about 15 years old and ready to pop. He didn't allow her to drive, didn't allow her to have a job. Her job was to cook, clean, and take care of the kids. She had her second son when she was still in her teens. The third son, which was my father, came out when she was in her 20s. And he was an oops, just like the first one. An oops. They stayed together up till my grandmother passed away in 2020. My grandmother didn't know life without a man who treated her horribly. He was abusive. He did drugs. Eventually he turned to the Lord and thought he was the best thing ever. No, not the Lord, not Jesus. No, himself. He thought he was the best thing ever. Thought that the man was the best thing that ever happened. Towards the end of my grandmother's death, towards when I started sticking up for her, because I was in my 20s, I could see it, I knew what was happening. They were no longer the happy little grandparents that I knew as a child that they would put on when I was around. And I would tell him where to go shove it. He did not like that. He told me I'm going to hell. I told him I would see him there. Sadly, he is still of the living. Why, I do not know. Why are old people like this? Why was this such a normal thing back in that day? These older men going after young teenage girls, or even just, like, the last one I heard was like an 8-year-old. A man in his 30s going after an 8-year-old. That is disgusting.
Grandma, you little victim. What the fuck?
No, but it's actually crazy to me how even like in modern times, straight people absolutely like program this as like normal behavior. Like I will never forget one time I was like at my youth group Bible study or whatever the fuck, and one of our leaders was talking about how she and her husband got together, or maybe it was like one of my friends was talking about how her parents got together or something. And it was like they had been dating and then they, I guess, got into a fight or broke up or something, and then she blocked him on everything and she wouldn't pick up his calls, and she like, just totally took herself off the map, like gave every indication that she wanted to be left alone. And they're like, but then he found her anyway, like basically stalked her, tracked her down, and found her anyway. And now they're married for 30 years. And I distinctly remember, even my teenage brainwashed self, I was probably like 15, and I distinctly remember saying, that sounds really creepy. And I got jumped. Like, the grown adults that led my youth group were like, no, it's not. It's not creepy. It's romantic. She was playing hard to get, and he was proving how much he liked her. And I was like, okay, if you say so. But even as a kid, I was like, what the fuck? What? What?
Please go out with me. Grandma, You little victim. What the fuck?
So my grandmother met my grandfather when she was 18 and he was in his mid-30s. And he had already been married before. She was his third wife, and he had already had 3 children whom he gave up for adoption when his wife left and he couldn't take care of the kids. So he meets my grandmother. They have 2 kids together, and then they start having multiple affairs throughout, both of them tit for tat. And my grandmother becomes pregnant, and my grandfather's like, you can keep it, it's fine, I'll raise it as my own. But the postpartum gets bad enough, she gives that child to her sister. Then they end up getting divorced, and my grandma meets her second husband, who was a Vietnam vet. And he put on a good show up until they got married. And then it turned out he was a massively disturbed and abusive individual. He ended up making my mom cut ties with her biological father in order to be adopted by him. And the dynamic was quite a difference because my grandfather was deaf and this was a hearing man. And so there was quite a big difference in the fighting styles as well. So anyways, she leaves him and now she's in like her mid-30s and living her best life and decides to become a man maker of her neighborhood, which she was very proud of. Maybe she still is. I don't know. But she told that story with a lot of pride. She becomes the man maker. Then she's set up. Somebody's like, hey, there's this guy. He's newly divorced. He's great. I've worked with him. You should meet him. He had been like a volunteer cop because I think you could do that if you had military training. And he was also a long haul truck driver. So like literally their first or second date is he's like, I got this shipment to pick up in California. Like he either had to fly out and drive it back or he had to drive out and get it, whatever. And she just goes. Like she just goes and they go driving across the country. And mind you, she still has 2 kids and they are in their school age. And she just traipses off across the country. So they start living together and dating when my mom is in like junior high school age. And when she's 17, my grandpa at this time is apparently working at a factory part-time. He brings home my dad, who is 21. There's a 4-year age difference between them. Not bad, but still. Brings him home unannounced and is just like, I think you guys should date, or like you'd be a good pair. And either he had already crashed my mom's prom the prior year, or he did after they met and they had been dating. Because my dad was a massive alcoholic. And so she meets my dad. They go on their first date for Valentine's Day. And he either crashes her prom after that, and then at some point they have a party they go to, and my dad just starts pouring Everclear into her drink to the point where eventually my mom is just drinking Everclear. And they both would tell this story, and there were no morals, there were no lessons with this story. It was like this weird, cutesy party story, you know? Like, my mom might roll her eyes, but my dad thought it was funny. And probably does to this day. And so he spiked her drink, and then, like, my mom cuts off the tap. Because it's a sin, they shouldn't have started. They need to get married first. So while my dad is driving up the hill in town, he throws a ring in her lap and he goes, you wanna? And they get married 7 months after their first date because my mom cut off the tap. That was specifically explained to me, by the way. Specifically explained. And then for the rest of their now 42-year marriage, I have listened to my father bitch and moan about the lack of intimacy and just what a raging bitch my mother is. And like, luckily my dad stopped drinking before I was born. But like, has just, they don't get along. They've never been respectful to each other. They're not nice to each other, and it's not a nice experience to be around, and it's one of the reasons I'm no contact. Like, you couldn't leave a room, my mom couldn't leave a room without my dad turning to one of us and just under his breath going, what a bitch. You know, or even if I have guests or people over, you know, it gets really embarrassing at some point. He's tried to divorce her multiple times, but in fundamentalism, he's got it in his head that if you have to get the woman's permission, and if you don't have permission from both people, you can't get a divorce. So he has to have, like, her blessing. It's weird. But it was definitely not a cute meet cute. None of the stories throughout were adorable, cute, or, like, amazing. And, like, everybody told them with fondness. Like, a great deal of fondness. So, fast forward, and my uncle, my dad's brother, meets his wife in the Philippines. And brings her back with her son. And, I all of a sudden have an aunt that is just 4 years older than me. And she gets here, and she kind of starts talking to my mom about how her perception of my uncle was a little bit different, and he's a little harsher. He's a little, you know, more argumentative. He's not as easygoing as she thought. All of these things, right? And my mom explains to her, and it's just so casual and, like, uplifting. She's like, oh yeah, I was like that when I first got together with, you know, he, like, his tone bothered me a lot. I was so sensitive. I cried a lot. Like, especially our first arguments, I would just fall apart. I'd just break down. But, you know, I've gotten used to him, and, you know, it's just, it doesn't bother me the same way anymore. And you'll get used to it. One of the worst pieces of advice I have ever heard in my life. And, like, they have their own dynamic now. She doesn't put up with a lot of shit. Like, she puts her foot down for stuff. And, like, I adore her, as a person. But like, that advice to me was just, you can definitely tell how people in those situations get taken advantage of. And, like, she could have ended up with somebody so much worse, but she was still deceived considerably. I think, like, a lot of people are deceived initially, right? But, like, then you had my whole family going, like, well, she might just want this, she might just want that. And it's like, no, I'm pretty sure she's the victim in all of this. And, like, you guys are going to continue, perpetuating that because, like, you think she owes him. That's why. So yeah, no, it kind of went full circle. It went all the way down from my grandma and my grandpa to the people that she continued to be involved with, down to my mom and her relationship with my dad. And even, and then my mom, like, continues to hand out that very harmful advice to sister-in-laws, to her own children, and things of that nature. And it's like, no, everything in your story from the beginning was wrong. And it should have ended there. It should have ended there.
And I met him, and he wouldn't leave my father's store for 3 weeks.
Okay, it's strange that this is even coming up on my timeline because I just got into, like, a Facebook debacle bait with this misogynistic man a few weeks ago about this very topic. So I shared a post that was saying, like, it doesn't matter if you have children or investments with a person. Like, if you're miserable, if you guys are just not it for each other, like, you should leave. There should be nothing that makes you just stay with a person when you're clearly miserable. And I referenced it with a story from my grandmother, well, my great-great-grandmother. And I captioned it saying, you know, I learned this from my great-grandmother because when my great-great-grandfather passed away, like, she was, like, visibly not distraught, like, at all. And it was weird to me even at a young age. Like, everybody in the family is sad, crying, blah, blah, blah. And she was just like nothing. I don't know if she was crying privately. I don't, whatever. But as far as publicly, sis had no emotion to it. And I was like, ma'am, you should be crying more than anybody out here, but whatever. So eventually I asked, and I'm like, Grandma, what's going on? Like, are you okay? Da, da, da. And she was like, your grandfather passing away was the happiest moment of my life. And I was like, this just turned dark. And she was like, don't get me wrong, I loved him very much. I grew to love him. But she was like, he was a very mean man to me and to your grandparents and to my other children. And I was very young whenever we got married. He was in the military. I was very, very young. They forced me to marry him. I did not want to marry anybody. I did not want to have children. He forced me to be a stay-at-home mom and have kids. That's not what I wanted to do. So really my life was taken over by somebody else. So I was not happy. But I grew to love him, and I was like, ew, like that sounds terrible. Like you were forced. Who knows? I mean, her parents probably sold her to his family for a freaking cow. Like, who knows? Because I didn't want to even get any deeper into that dark story. But the guy legitimately commented and was like, well, it couldn't have been that bad because you said they stayed together for all those years. Do you understand? Like, back then, like, women didn't have any rights. Like, she couldn't have argued with her dad and be like, no, Dad, you can't sell me for this cow. Like, I'm staying home at 12 years old. Like, she was a kid. There's nothing she could have done about that. Then once she got older, like, this is all she knows. They weren't allowed to work. They didn't have any like education, life skills. What other was she going to do with like 12 kids? Run away and go where? You know what I mean? So like, yeah, you condition yourself. It's a victim mentality to condition yourself and just sit in it because you have no other option. And like a lot of our grandmothers, if you really sit down and talk to them, went through this, like, and that's scary because a lot of our families would not be like here if it was not for that. And that's crazy to me. Like, if you've ever seen Color Purple and the Mr. and Celie like scene, that's not just like a made up, emotional touch. That's really what they were doing to women back then. And it was on both sides of the track. It wasn't just like, it was their people too. Like this was really happening to women. Like we were bought and sold like animals. Like we still don't have the rights. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, it's a little scary, but y'all really need to have conversations with your grandparents because grandma's probably been with granddaddy for like 60 some years and never even liked him in the first place. He was probably like the weird older guy down the street that was like watching her play with her kid friends, like jacks and stuff on the sidewalk. And he was like, that one's cute. Let me get her. Just saying.
Grandma, you little victim.
So I've seen a lot of these clips, and on the surface, when I compare my grandmother's story to those, in the very beginning, it doesn't look too bad. So my grandmother was legal age. A lot of these girls in these stories are 13, 14, 15. My grandmother was 20. But the thing is, my granddad was 40. And his mother-in-law was 39. So he was a year older than even his mother-in-law. Or at least that's the story we were raised with. See, my parents raised us as a Mormon. And one thing that the LDS community is pretty big on is genealogy. And for some reason, I don't know if my parents thought that part wouldn't stick with us or what, but it did, at least in my case. I'm not, huge on it, but, occasionally I like looking and that kind of stuff. And when I went looking, I found out that my granddad was actually 26 years older than my grandmother, and he was 7 years older than her mom. I don't know, 26 sounded worse than 20, 20 sounded okay. I don't know what the cutoff was. But I did also find some info that even my dad may not have known. So apparently grandma was not wife number one. At the minimum, so far, I found that she was wife number 3. Wife number 1, he married when he was 17, and she was 37. So we had a flip of the age group there. He had one child with her, which we were never told about. But my dad definitely knew of her existence because he named one of his children after her. I don't know if he ever met her or anything along those lines. He never told his kids about her. But he did have one older sister. Now, the next wife, I don't know if that was before my grandmother. I believe it is because there's a lot of years in there. But I'm pretty sure it was before my grandmother. It was in Florida. They had 3 children together, and he abandoned them. So he took off, left the kids behind, left her behind, went back home, eventually married my grandmother, had 3 more kids. As far as I know, my dad does not know about those 3 kids in Florida. They know about Grandpa. They know that he had other wife, had other kids. The person the oldest, who would have been my brother, my dad's brother, ended up, working as the man of the household and taking care of his siblings, and apparently has very, very strong feelings about my granddad that are not very pleasant, that he's passed down to the rest of the children. But so Grandpa and his brother were both wandering men. They were both musicians. Grandpa was a yodeling, singing blues cowboy. So he was really popular in California, Mexico, Texas in the 20s and 30s. Friends of Bob Hope, the music, the radio scene, all that kind of stuff for a while before he went back home. But so there's no telling how many other families there are out there. Because like I said, he was 46 when he met my grandmother. He had a lot of travel and a lot of times for friendships under his belt.
If you stayed this long, you truly like Jesus. Wow, these stories. And to think that when they say this story while you were young, it sounds like a love story. Oh, grandpa is so cute. Grandma is so cute. Oh, your grandparents, they make it look as if it's a very beautiful love story. But then when you really listen, or at this your adult age, and you've learned so many things about men, you've seen how the world is, you will see that it is not it's a little cute love story at all. It is just a young girls getting, groomed by this men. And this made me remember parts of Nigeria as a culture and a part of Nigeria. I think they are the Hausas. When I feel like when the child starts saying menstruation, she's already due for marriage. I don't know if they still do it, but they do it. They did it for a very long time. In fact, there are a lot of movies connected to that part. So you see men that has like 3 to 4 wives. Let's say just say 3 wives, and he's already looking at a young girl that you just gave birth to, and like, I'm going to marry her. So he's going to wait for you to immediately start seeing your period. The family will take you, or they will just take you, like you're going to get married. And the funniest part is they get pregnant immediately. Of course, and not just one child. Two, most of them die. Most of them, they don't make it. Most of them, and some that make it, they'll act like they will end up, being in love with the man. They might say, oh, your dad, probably if you ask them for the love story, they'll say, oh, your dad really likes me when I was young. He already be looking at me that, oh, I'm going to be his wife. And, when it got to a stage that I was ready to get married and he came to meet me, we grew in love together. That's not love, that's abuse. And to think that the parents that even give out their children like that, I don't know. But sometimes I would say it's culture, so I don't blame them. It's now that people eyes are opening and people are saying that all this is just a bad thing or it's just scam. So people are being very careful not to put their children in that kind of state. I wish I heard my grandma love story. I would have loved to share with you all. Have you heard your grandma love story before? Let me know down the comment section. I really love to read the love story. Probably I'll make a video reading your grandma love story in the comment section. It's a long video already, and I'll just end this video here. Thank you all so much for sticking around to this point. I hope you enjoyed this one. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe. And kindly turn on post notification bells can get notified once I upload another interesting video like this one. And I'll see you all in my next one. Bye.